The sun timidly peeked through the thin curtains of the living room window. Layla, a 12-year-old black girl, descended the stairs of her small home, holding a book in one hand and a worn-out backpack in the other. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the clatter of pans her mother, Janet, was handling in the kitchen. Malik, the 1-year-old baby, played with a plastic bowl on the floor, banging it like a drum. "Good morning, my girl," Janet said with a smile as she flipped an egg in the frying pan. "Are you going to eat before you leave, or are you in a rush?" "Good morning, Mom. I have a few minutes," Layla replied, setting her backpack on the floor and sitting at the table. She grabbed a piece of bread and began chewing slowly, watching her mother. Janet, always busy, balanced household chores with the responsibility of taking care of Malik and working as a seamstress in a factory. It was clear she bore the weight of the world on her shoulders, but her energy never wavered. "Mom, can I take a slice of the cake you made yesterday for lunch?" "My friend Mia wants to try it," Layla asked. "Of course, you can, but only if you promise to wash the dishes when you get back from school," Janet replied, winking playfully. "One slice for Mia, one for you. No sneaking extras." Malik giggled from the floor as if he understood the conversation. Janet crouched to pick him up, placing him on her lap while finishing setting the table. "This boy is going to grow up and give me even more work," she joked, kissing Malik's head. Despite its simplicity, the house was full of warmth. The worn walls were decorated with Layla's drawings, and the living room was scattered with Malik's toys. It was a space that, though modest, was deeply cherished by those who lived there. When Janet opened the door to take Layla to school, she noticed the mailbox was full. As Layla adjusted her backpack on her shoulders, Janet grabbed the stack of letters and began leafing through them absent-mindedly. "More bills," she murmured. Her expression changed as she picked up an envelope from Atlas Realty. The logo in the top left corner was impossible to ignore. "Let's go, Layla," Janet said, slipping the letter into her apron pocket. "I don't want you to be late." Layla noticed something odd in her mother's tone but chose not to press. They walked together to school, chatting about trivial things like Layla's upcoming math test and her music lessons. At the school entrance, Janet kissed her daughter's forehead and headed back home. The sun had already risen, but it seemed like Janet had been awake all night. While Malik crawled around the living room, she held the phone in one hand and made notes on a piece of paper with the other. Her voice was tense but controlled. "Yes, sir. I'm sure this is a mistake. I've always paid on time." "Yes, of course, I understand." "Thank you anyway," she said before hanging up and letting out a frustrated sigh. Layla observed from a distance, sitting on the couch with Malik playing beside her. She had never seen her mother so worried, and it made her uneasy. "Mom, is everything okay?" she asked, moving closer. Janet forced a smile and shook her head. "It's fine, sweetheart. Just a few things I need to sort out." Layla could tell her mother was trying to shield her, but she didn't press further. She knew that when Janet was like this, it was better to wait. In the kitchen, Janet made another call, this time to her own mother. "Mom, I got an eviction notice," she said, trying to keep her voice low so Layla wouldn't overhear. "I knew it was Wallace," her mother replied, her tone sharp with reproach. "He never takes no for an answer." "Do you think this has to do with when he tried to buy the house?" Janet asked. "Of course it does," her mother said. "He's greedy and vindictive." "But do you have proof you paid the rent?" "I have all the receipts," Janet said, looking at the stack of papers she had gathered. "But the documents he presented to the court, they look so real. You know how he operates. He has money and power. But you're strong too, my girl. Don't let him intimidate you." Janet thanked her mother and hung up. Her mother's words gave her some comfort, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She needed professional help. Janet spent the next few hours calling lawyers. Each call felt like a repetition of the previous one, polite refusals or exorbitant fees far beyond her means. Layla, watching silently, began to realize the problem was more serious than she had imagined. Finally, after several attempts, Janet found a lawyer willing to help her at an affordable price. He sounded young and inexperienced, but it was all she could afford. "Send me the documents, and I'll review the case," he said over the phone. "Thank you." "Thank you so much," Janet said, feeling a small sense of relief. She picked up Malik and cradled him as she took a deep breath. There was a long road ahead, but at least now she had a plan. That afternoon, Janet tried to go about her routine, but it was clear her mind was elsewhere. Layla noticed her mother organizing papers and calling her job to explain she would need to take the next day off to deal with personal issues. When Layla asked if she could help, Janet smiled and said, "You already help so much by taking care of your brother. That's all I need from you." But Layla wasn't convinced. As she played with Malik, she stole glances at her mother, who seemed lost in thought. Layla felt that, somehow, she needed to do more. But how? She was just a child. That night, after putting Malik to sleep, Janet sat again with the pile of documents. The rent receipts were there, neatly organized and dated, but she knew it would be a challenge to prove that Wallace's papers were forged. He had the best lawyers and nearly unlimited resources. Worse, he seemed to have no boundaries in what he was willing to do to get what he wanted. "Stay strong," Janet murmured to herself, echoing her mother's words. But the truth was, at that moment, she felt incredibly alone. Layla, hearing her mother's muffled voice from the living room, got out of bed and peeked through the slightly open door. She saw Janet with her head in her hands, her shoulders slumped. It was a sight Layla would never forget. It solidified a decision in her mind: she would do whatever it took to help her mother, even if she didn't know where to start. The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension in the house was palpable. Janet frantically organized the papers, reviewing the rent receipts for the 5th time. Malik whimpered in his makeshift crib in the living room, and Layla, noticing her mother's nervousness, tried to help. She picked up Malik and began to sing softly, trying to soothe him. "Thank you, sweetheart," Janet said, adjusting her jacket. Her eyes showed exhaustion and worry, but she tried to smile. "You're being amazing. I'll need you to take care of your brother for a few hours. Grandma's coming to stay with you." Layla nodded, but part of her wanted to go along. She wanted to be by her mother's side in that moment. "Will everything be okay, Mom?" she asked. Janet hesitated for a moment, then replied, "It will. We're going to fight." Shortly after, Layla's grandmother arrived. A robust woman with sharp eyes, she hugged her granddaughter tightly. "Don't worry, dear. Your mom knows what she's doing." But as Janet walked out the door, she wasn't so sure herself. The courtroom was intimidating, with its high ceilings and dark wood-paneled walls. Janet sat next to her lawyer, Mr. Miller, a young man who seemed as nervous as she was. On the other side of the room, Arthur Wallace sat with 2 lawyers, his immaculate suit and confident smile radiating arrogance. The hearing began with Wallace presenting documents that proved Janet had been behind on her rent for months. He spoke with rehearsed calm, explaining that, unfortunately, Atlas Realty had no choice but to initiate eviction proceedings. Mr. Miller stood, visibly unsure, and began questioning the documents. "Your Honor, we have evidence that my client has paid rent regularly. These receipts show consistent deposits in line with the lease agreement." The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, examined Janet's documents. "Mr. Wallace," she said, "can you explain why the receipts presented by Ms. Janet don't match your company's records?" Wallace smiled, as if he had been expecting the question. "Certainly, Your Honor. Atlas Realty maintains detailed records of all payments. It's possible my client made an error or that these receipts are duplicates or incomplete." "An error?" Janet murmured, incredulous. She felt the blood rush to her face, but Miller lightly touched her arm, signaling her to remain calm. "Your Honor," Wallace continued, "Atlas Realty operates with complete transparency. We are willing to cooperate with any necessary investigation." The judge nodded, but Janet could tell she was undecided. Wallace's documents looked convincing, and Miller didn't have the experience or resources to refute them effectively. The hearing ended with the judge postponing her decision to a final hearing in 2 weeks, giving both sides time to present additional evidence. Outside the courtroom, Janet and Miller spoke in hushed tones. "I believe you," he said, "but we need something more concrete. Wallace's documents are strong, even if they're forged. It's going to be tough to prove otherwise without an expert." Janet nodded, feeling an even heavier weight on her shoulders. Wallace crossed paths with them in the hallway and stopped for a moment. "Nice try today, Janet," he said with a cold smile. "I hope you have a better plan for the next hearing. Because, frankly, you're wasting your time." Before Janet could respond, he walked away, leaving her with a knot in her stomach. When Janet returned home, she found Layla and Malik playing with their grandmother in the living room. The grandmother looked at Janet and saw the defeated expression on her face. "How did it go?" she asked. "It's postponed," Janet replied, trying to hide her frustration. "We still have time." Layla approached, holding her mother's hand. "You're going to make it, Mom. I know you will." Janet looked at her daughter and tried to smile. "Thank you, my little one. I'll do everything I can to protect our home." Later that night, Layla overheard her mother talking to her grandmother in the kitchen. "He's relentless," Janet was saying. "He won't stop until he takes everything from me." "Then you have to fight harder," her grandmother replied. "He may have power, but you have courage. And sometimes, that's enough." Layla went back to bed with those words echoing in her mind. Courage. Maybe she needed to be brave too, even if she didn't know exactly how. The wind swayed the trees in front of Layla's grandmother's house as she climbed the porch steps, carrying a bag of groceries. Inside, the comforting smell of mint tea filled the air. Her grandmother, a woman with dark skin and neatly kept gray hair, welcomed her with a warm hug. "My little warrior," her grandmother said, holding Layla by the shoulders and studying her as if searching for something hidden. "You've been so quiet. What's on your mind?" Layla bit her lip, hesitant. I don't really know what's going on, Grandma. But I know Mom is scared. And so am I." Her grandmother led Layla to the kitchen and placed a cup of hot tea in front of her. "Listen, Layla. I know it feels scary right now. But your mom is strong. And so are you. But how can I help?" Layla asked, her voice trembling. "I just take care of Malik, but that doesn't fix anything. And I don't want them to take our house." Her grandmother held Layla's hands and looked deeply into her eyes. "Sometimes, helping means being present. Taking care of your brother, giving strength to your mom. That's already more than enough. But the most important thing is to have courage, my girl. When everything seems lost, that's when we find our strength." Layla nodded, but her grandmother's words echoed differently in her mind. To her, courage meant action. Doing something. As Layla returned home, the sky was tinged orange by the setting sun. She saw a black car parked in front of the house, and as she approached, she recognized Wallace leaning against the door, talking to her mother. Janet stood with her arms crossed, her face serious, but there was something in her posture that seemed tired. Layla approached quietly and hid behind a tree, trying to listen. Wallace was speaking in a low tone, but his words were sharp. "You know this is pointless, Janet," he said. "You can keep pretending you have a chance in court, but we both know how this will end." "I have the right to fight for my home," Janet replied, her voice firm, though tinged with emotion. Wallace took a step closer, narrowing the space between them. "I've tried to be reasonable. I even offered you a dignified way out. But you refused. Now, I'm going to take everything from you. Your house, your security, even your children, if I have to." Layla felt a chill run down her spine. She held her breath, trying to absorb what she was hearing. "You have no right," Janet said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "My family is not something you can touch. And who's going to stop me?" Wallace asked with a cruel smile. If you mention this conversation in court, I'll make sure no one believes you. And when it's all over, I'll make sure you never see your children again. I'll destroy your life, Janet." Janet remained still, but Layla noticed the tremble in her hands. Wallace looked at her for another moment before turning away and getting into his car, driving off slowly. Layla stood frozen behind the tree, her heart racing. She had never felt so scared and so furious at the same time. What Wallace had said was wrong. Terribly wrong. But the fear that he might follow through on his threats left her paralyzed. She entered the house quietly, finding her mother sitting on the couch with her face in her hands. Malik was in the crib, playing with a stuffed animal, oblivious to the tension around him. Layla wanted to say something, wanted to ask why Wallace had been there, but she couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat. Janet looked up at her and gave her a weak smile when she noticed her presence. "How was Grandma's house?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "It was normal," Layla replied, feeling guilty for not sharing what she had heard. Janet sighed and stood up. "I'm going to make dinner. Can you watch Malik for me?" Layla nodded and went to the crib, picking up her little brother. As she cradled him, her mind raced. Wallace was playing dirty, but her mother seemed too scared to confront him. Layla didn't know exactly what she could do, but one thing was certain: she couldn't just stand by. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the final hearing. The tension was palpable. Janet and Layla sat side by side, with Malik on their grandmother's lap in the waiting area. Janet clutched the papers so tightly her fingers turned white, while Layla looked around, absorbing every detail. The large room, with its dark wooden walls and neatly arranged benches, seemed even more imposing than the last time. Wallace's confident demeanor, seated with his attorney across the room, made Layla's stomach churn. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Thompson, a woman with short gray hair and a stern expression, adjusted her glasses and motioned for everyone to sit. Hearing resumed in the case of Atlas Realty versus Janet Carter, announced the bailiff. Wallace was the first to speak. His lawyer once again presented documents that allegedly showed Janet's rental delinquency. The documents were detailed, well-organized, and incredibly convincing. The lawyer emphasized Atlas Realty's impeccable record and stated that any error on their part would be highly unlikely. On the other side, Janet's lawyer, Mr. Miller, seemed hesitant but submitted the rent receipts as counter-evidence. He argued that his client had always paid her rent on time and suggested the possibility of forgery in Wallace's documents. Judge Thompson leaned forward. "Mr. Wallace," she said, "can you explain the discrepancy between the receipts presented by Ms. Janet and your company's records?" Wallace adjusted his suit and replied with a polished smile, "Certainly, Your Honor. Atlas Realty uses a digital system to maintain its records. It's possible that my client submitted receipts that don't align with our updated system. I'm not implying any ill intent, but such errors can occur." "Errors?" Janet muttered incredulously. She felt anger rising, but Miller gently placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to remain calm. "Your Honor," Wallace continued, "Atlas Realty operates with full transparency. We're more than willing to cooperate with any investigation necessary." The judge nodded, though her expression remained neutral. Wallace's documents appeared solid, and Miller lacked the resources or experience to challenge them convincingly. The hearing seemed to be tilting in Wallace's favor. Layla's frustration grew as she watched Wallace weave his narrative. She clenched her fists under the table, the memory of his threats to her mother fresh in her mind. When Miller rose to speak again, he made an effort to cast doubt on Wallace's credibility, suggesting his company had a history of questionable practices. But Wallace remained unshaken, countering with calm, calculated responses. "Your Honor," Wallace said, turning to the judge with feigned sympathy, "I understand this is difficult for everyone involved. But Atlas Realty is simply enforcing the terms of a legal agreement. This case is not personal." The words struck a nerve in Layla. Not personal? She thought of Wallace's threats, his smug confidence, and how he had vowed to destroy her family. It was personal to her. Without thinking, Layla tugged on Miller's sleeve and whispered, "I want to speak." Miller turned to her, startled. "You want what?" "I want to speak," she repeated, her voice steady. "I have something to say." Miller hesitated, then stood. "Your Honor, my client requests permission for her daughter, Layla Carter, to testify as a witness." The room buzzed with whispers. Wallace frowned, and his attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, this is a rental dispute, and a child's testimony is irrelevant." The judge raised her hand, silencing the protests. "A witness may testify if their statement is deemed relevant to the case." "Miss Carter, do you believe you have something important to contribute?" Layla nodded and stood, her hands trembling slightly. Janet looked at her daughter with a mix of concern and pride. "Layla, you don't have to do this," she whispered, but Layla shook her head. "I need to," she replied, stepping up to the witness stand. After the bailiff administered the oath, Layla adjusted the microphone and began. "My mom always pays the rent," she said, her voice clear. "I see her saving the money, counting every penny, even when we have to go without other things." Wallace's eyes narrowed as Layla continued. "But that's not all I want to say. I overheard Mr. Wallace talking to my mom at our house." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Layla. "What?" Janet whispered, shocked. "Your Honor," Wallace's attorney interrupted, standing again. "This is clearly an attempt to manipulate the court with emotional appeals." Overruled, Judge Thompson said firmly. "Continue, Miss Carter." Layla took a deep breath, recalling her grandmother's words about courage. "The night before this hearing, Mr. Wallace came to our house. He told my mom he would take everything from her if she didn't do what he wanted. He said he'd destroy our family and make sure she never saw her kids again." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Wallace's face turned pale as his attorney tried to contain the chaos. "This is outrageous," Wallace's lawyer protested. Overruled, the judge said sharply. "Go on, Miss Carter." Layla's voice grew steadier. "He said no one would believe her if she told anyone. He said he could fake anything to make it look like it was her fault. I heard everything. I was hiding behind a tree." Janet stared at her daughter, her eyes brimming with tears. She hadn't known Layla had overheard the conversation. Wallace, on the other hand, looked visibly shaken. His confident demeanor was gone. Judge Thompson adjusted her glasses and fixed her gaze on Wallace. "Mr. Wallace, these are very serious allegations. Do you have a response?" Wallace stammered. I never said any of that. She's just a child. She's confused." "She doesn't seem confused to me," the judge replied coolly. Miller seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, based on Layla's testimony, we request an investigation into Mr. Wallace's conduct. This is no longer just an eviction case. There are clear indications of harassment, document forgery, and abuse of power." Wallace tried to stand, but the judge cut him off. "Sit down, Mr. Wallace. This court will take these accusations seriously." Layla returned to her seat, and Janet pulled her into a tight embrace. "I had no idea you heard all of that. My brave girl." The judge adjourned the hearing with a clear decision: the eviction was suspended, and Wallace would be formally investigated. As he left the courtroom, Wallace's arrogant smile was replaced by an expression of defeat. The sound of sirens echoed in Janet's mind as she walked out of the courthouse with Layla by her side. The morning air was crisp, but the heat of tension still lingered on her skin. Malik babbled in their grandmother's arms, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions around them. For the first time in weeks, Janet felt a sliver of relief. Layla's words had changed everything. "You were incredible, Layla," Janet said, holding her daughter's hand tightly. "I don't know where you found such courage." Layla looked up at her mother, her face still marked by the intensity of the moment. "I just thought about what Grandma said, that we need to be brave. And I thought about you. I couldn't let him do this to us." Janet couldn't hold back her tears. She pulled Layla into a tight embrace as their grandmother gently stroked her granddaughter's hair. That same day, the news of the suspended eviction and the accusations against Arthur Wallace began spreading through the town. The impact was immediate. Atlas Realty, once considered an untouchable company, saw its reputation crumble within hours. Reports of questionable practices emerged, and former tenants of Wallace were inspired to file their own complaints, emboldened by Janet and Layla's courage. As for Wallace, he became the focus of a criminal investigation. The threats he had made against Janet, combined with document forgery and abuse of power, were enough to launch multiple legal actions against him. The court froze Atlas Realty's assets while the investigations continued, leaving Wallace in a vulnerable position. A week later, Janet received an official letter from the court informing her that the eviction had been permanently annulled. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Reading the words that confirmed her family's home was safe, she began to cry. Layla, who had been caring for Malik in the living room, rushed to her mother's side. "Mom, what is it?" she asked, concerned. "We're safe," Janet replied, smiling through her tears. "They can't take our home anymore." Layla hugged her mother tightly, and for the first time in a long while, they both felt they could finally breathe. Life began to return to normal, but the experience left a lasting mark on the family. Though relieved, Janet remained cautious. She meticulously saved every receipt and document, ensuring she would never be caught off guard again. Layla's grandmother, ever practical, encouraged Janet to seek legal advice to protect herself in the future. Meanwhile, Layla became something of a local celebrity. Neighbors stopped her on the street to commend her bravery, and even at school, her classmates and teachers treated her with newfound respect. "You're famous now," joked Mia, her best friend, as they walked through the school hallway. "I just told the truth," Layla replied shyly. But deep down, she felt a quiet pride in what she had done. She had helped her mother, and that meant everything. One afternoon, Janet and Layla were invited to a community meeting organized by former tenants of Atlas Realty. The group wanted to share their stories and plan collective actions against Wallace's abusive practices. During the meeting, Layla listened intently as adults recounted their experiences. Many had been intimidated or deceived by Wallace and his team but had never had the courage or resources to fight back. "If it weren't for your daughter," one woman told Janet, "I don't think we'd be here today. She gave us hope." Janet smiled, but it was Layla who responded. "My mom was the brave one. I just did what anyone would do." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, and Janet held her daughter's hand, feeling prouder than ever. A few weeks later, Wallace's case went to trial. He faced formal charges of document forgery, harassment, and attempted intimidation. The court ordered him to pay significant damages to Janet and suspended all his real estate activities until the case was resolved. On the day of the sentencing, Janet brought Layla and Malik to the courthouse. The room was packed with journalists and community members. When the judge announced the verdict, a collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Arthur Wallace is sentenced to 2 years in prison for his actions and is ordered to pay $50,000 in damages to Ms. Janet Carter, the judge declared. Janet covered her mouth in shock. Layla looked at Wallace as he was escorted out of the courtroom, his face defeated, his arrogance completely gone. As they exited the courthouse, Layla's grandmother was waiting outside with Malik. "I told you, you're stronger than you think," she said, embracing Janet and Layla. Months later, the Carter home was livelier than ever. Janet used the settlement to make repairs to the house, something she had always wanted but could never afford. Layla got a new set of books, and Malik received educational toys. For Layla, the biggest change was within herself. The courtroom experience ignited a new passion in her, a desire to fight for justice. "One day, I'm going to be a judge," she told her mother one evening while helping wash the dishes. "A judge?" Janet asked, surprised. "Why a judge?" "Because judges make the rules," Layla said with a smile. "And I want to make sure no one ever goes through what we went through." Janet dried her hands and pulled Layla into a hug. "I have no doubt you'll make it, my brave girl." As Malik played with his toy pots on the kitchen floor, Janet looked at her children and felt a peace she hadn't known in a long time. The battle had been hard, but they had won. And now, the future seemed brighter than ever. Laughter echoed through the Carter family's small home on a sunny afternoon. Layla, now 16 years old, was seated on the couch reviewing notes for a school oratory competition. Beside her, Malik, now 5, played with a toy truck, mimicking the sound of an engine. Janet watched the scene from the kitchen, where she was preparing a chocolate cake, Layla's favorite. A mixture of pride and nostalgia filled her heart. It was hard to believe that years had passed since that decisive day in court. Although time had softened the memories of their battle against Wallace, its impact was still deeply felt. The house, renovated with the settlement money, had become a cozy and welcoming place. Janet had found financial stability, working as an administrative assistant for a small local business. Malik, with his boundless energy, filled the house with laughter, and Layla, ever determined, continued to pursue her dream. "Ready for tomorrow, Layla?" Janet asked as she entered the living room with a tray of juice and cookies. Layla smiled, setting her notes aside. "I think so. My speech is almost perfect." Janet sat beside her daughter and gently stroked her hair. "You have an incredible talent for words. No matter the outcome, I'm already proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," Layla said, picking up a cookie. She paused, as if reflecting. "You know, it all started in that courtroom. When I got up to testify, it was the first time I felt like my voice really mattered." Janet nodded, recalling that moment vividly. "You saved our family, Layla. Your courage changed everything." Layla laughed softly, slightly embarrassed. "I just did what had to be done. But now, I want to do more. I want to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. I want to be a judge, like Judge Thompson." Janet felt tears welling up. "You'll be an amazing judge, Layla. I have no doubt about that." A few weeks later, Layla participated in the oratory competition. Her speech, titled "Courage and Justice," recounted her courtroom experience and how it inspired her to pursue a future in the legal system. The audience sat in rapt silence as she spoke, her voice filled with passion and determination. "Justice isn't just about following rules," Layla said in her closing remarks. "It's about ensuring everyone has a fair chance, no matter who they are or where they come from. That's what I learned that day, and it's what I want to defend for the rest of my life." When the competition ended, Layla received a standing ovation. Not only did she win first place, but she also captured the hearts of everyone in the room. That evening, after returning home with her trophy, Layla placed it on the living room shelf. Next to it were family photos, including a recently taken one with Janet, Malik, and her grandmother. The small shelf felt like an altar to resilience and love. Janet watched her daughter with a smile. "This is just the beginning, my brave girl. Just the beginning." Layla turned to her mother and smiled back. "Everything I do is for us, Mom. It always will be." As the night fell and the house grew quiet, Janet reflected on how far they had come. The battle against Wallace had been grueling, but it had also been the catalyst for something greater. Layla had found her voice, and that was something no one could ever take away. And so, with a bright future ahead of them, the Carter family moved forward, stronger than ever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.